I remember a very clear moment when I was, who knows, I was probably 7, 8, 9, or 10 years old, where I was just walking into a room that was my playroom essentially. I walked into the room and it was as if the matrix just settled down upon me. And I knew on some level my rational mind just completely overruled anything else, and I realized, wow, there's no magic in the world. I completely stopped believing in any sort of magic. I completely fell for the billiard ball materialistic explanation of the universe at that point. It just completely engulfed me, and it made me sad, but it made sense at a certain level. So I just completely stepped away from any belief in magic, and I really clearly remember that moment. Otherwise, life was fun. It was play, it was friends, it was sports, it was family. Maybe a bit boring from a certain perspective, but that's not how I felt it at the time. And I was pretty young when I first experienced psychedelic. My life before psychedelics only goes up until about 14 years of age. I grew up in a very kind of white bread, middle class neighborhood in Kitchener, Ontario, Canada, near Toronto. I thankfully have very loving parents. They're still married today. Incredible human beings who are very giving, very helpful. Also very kind of by the book, as it were. I definitely grew up in the 80s where just say no to drugs was there. I very much believed in that propaganda until a certain point. I never thought I would try a drug as an early child. Probably when I started learning about kind of the plant medicine aspect of things. I think it's when I first heard about ayahuasca, which was on a news story on CBC radio. It was a news story interviewing and featuring Jeremy Narby, who wrote The Cosmic Serpent. And it was a description of his book. I was in Vancouver at the time and just heard this story of ayahuasca, and it was talked about how it was being used to combat addiction. And the metaphor was that it's like using a powder keg to blow out an oil well fire. Just something about the way this book was described had me running to what I knew to be kind of a spiritual bookstore that might have books like this, Banyan Books in Vancouver. I ran in and I must have seemed like a wild man when I came in, because I went in, I found this book, and I went to the guy at the desk. I'm like, do you hear what this is saying? This is crazy. It's essentially talking about different worlds that you can see when you take these drugs. I think it was after that I kind of really started understanding the shamanistic aspect of these plants, and I really got into Carlos Castaneda and read all of those books multiple times. And then I eventually started hanging out at a store in Vancouver, the original Urban Shaman in Vancouver, which then got called The Spirit Within. Really kind of connected with plant medicine people, but I still didn't know. I think it took a while still for me to know that there had actually been Western history of using these in a therapeutic setting as well. Before that, it was all fun and games, but it was also, I remember a clear moment when I was on LSD with a bunch of friends as a young man, where I said to everybody I was with, I'm like, this is what adults have forgotten about that has made the world so screwed up. So even though I didn't know about the therapeutic effects, and I didn't have a real traumatic childhood that I needed to heal from psychedelics, so it didn't even kind of have that secondary therapeutic effect that I picked up on, because that healing wasn't really needed, I guess, in a certain way. So I didn't kind of have the residual feeling of being healed after some of those journeys. But something still rang through that said, yeah, there's something more to these medicines. There's some kind of message here that the adults have forgotten about. Through a few cracks that allowed the light of divinity to come into my life in different ways, I started looking into spirituality and started looking into all religions and trying to look for the similarities between them all. And I had really started being curious about this spiritual path and reading a lot of great teachings that seemed to be saying something, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. So I was, without knowing that psychedelics or a psychedelic experience might offer a greater connection to something like that, I was definitely kind of fumbling through the woods looking for a greater connection to that thing we might call divine. I was working in Vancouver at a sales job. I was very bored in the office, didn't feel like making sales calls, and I was scrolling through the internet. And I was on a great website called erowid.org, which talks about a lot of different psychedelics and psychedelic experiences, has a lot of trip reports in it. I was on this website this day and I clicked on DMT, and I had heard of DMT as an active ingredient in ayahuasca, but I had never heard that you could actually consume it on its own. So I was reading these really incredible journeys with DMT. I said then and there, wow, I have got to try this. This sounds incredible. And I was sharing the office with a guy who was a good guy, and he was obviously bored because he said, I'm bored. Does that shop still sell cannabis under the counter? I said, yes, it does. Let's go. So we went to a shop I mentioned earlier called The Spirit Within. And when we walked in, it was a different vibe than normal. I knew most of the people who worked there, and I didn't know the young woman that was working behind the counter that day. There was a bunch of beanbag chairs set up in there. There was a bit of a lounge area. And I did know one guy there, and I said to this guy, hey, do you know if we can still buy weed from this lady? And he said, yeah, probably, but don't bother. This guy's selling $20 eighths. A shaggy-haired guy selling $20 eighths of cannabis. Stepped outside and did this deal, and just through that conversation, he mentioned, hey, I've got some DMT. Do you want it? So I went from, 3 hours ago having never heard of DMT to meeting this guy who now all of a sudden was offering me DMT. And I realized afterwards, and in hindsight and with a bit of experience and because of the dosing that we use, that it was actually 5-MeO DMT. So we did this deal, and I got this 5-MeO DMT. We went back to the store, and there was a guy that I know working at the store this time. And I said, hey, can we come back when you guys close and consume this DMT? And he said, no problem. Another crazy part of the story is, as I'm walking out of the store to kill a couple hours before I come back at 7 o'clock, this guy is standing in the door and he goes, hey, it's my birthday. I always do DMT on my birthday. Do you know where I can get any? Like, dude, I happen to have some DMT in my pocket. If you want to come back at 7 o'clock, we can do it together. So at 7 o'clock, there were 3 of us. And they each went before I did and seemed to have incredible journeys. The guy, his instructions were just put a few granules of the substance onto the cannabis. So that's how if you're going to do regular DMT, you need 100 milligrams of it kind of thing for a proper journey. We used, it must have been 5 to 10 milligrams of this stuff we put on. In hindsight, I realized it was 5-MeO DMT, plus the experience is more like 5-MeO DMT now that I've done it a few times. So I took this pipe, held the lighter, took it in. As soon as I took it in, I could feel awareness of every cell in my body. And then I could feel every cell in my body aware of me being aware of it. and there was this interplay of awareness back and forth between all of these cells. That awareness exploded to the whole universe. I could feel awareness of every atom in the universe, it felt like. And I could feel every atom in the universe aware of me being aware of it. And then there was this incredible interplay of energy. And it really felt, when it first came on, it felt as though there was a knot at this third eye area, and this third eye area just completely unwound, and that led to this awareness. So through that process, it was almost like the ego got destroyed. Like it was just, there was a witness in me that was experiencing this, and there seemed to be a presence that was guiding it. So this presence brought my attention to sounds that I could hear coming off of Commercial Drive. And this presence indicated to me that every sound I'd ever heard, every sight that I had ever seen was sent to me with intent. It was like the present was literally pre-sent, as if somebody was sending you a package with every sight, every sound, that there was a higher intelligence guiding it all. It felt as though I was like a child of creation in the crib of creation. It felt as though I was the one child of the universe, like I was Christ, like I was Buddha in that. And along with this experience was the understanding that so is everyone. Paradoxically, we are all the one child of the universe. Just this incredible knowing and this sense of something I couldn't quite put my finger on, and my English-speaking voice in my head kind of started gaining traction again, and I'm like, what? What does it mean? And this presence just came back with, it's perfect. You can't mess it up. There is an underlying perfection to everything. Even your ideas of imperfection need this bed of perfection that they can spring from. It's perfect. You can't mess it up. It was the best news. The English-speaking voice in my head again said, this is awesome. Can I go back to normal now? And the message I was delivered was, yes, but this is your heritage. This is what you're trying to work back to through all of the spiritual practices that you're reading about. Ultimately, you want to work back to this without the use of any substance, because this is where you are supposed to inhabit. The consciousness kind of came back into my body at that point, and I opened my eyes, and there was a table in front of me with a chessboard on it, and it felt that with the slightest intent I could move those chess pieces. I didn't do that, but I stood up, and I literally started jumping for joy. I started jumping and was just so thrilled. And in certain ways, I haven't stopped jumping for joy since. That was the most transformational psychedelic journey of my life. It really showed me beyond some kind of veil. And once you've seen beyond that veil, you can never quite buy the bullshit of the world in the same way. And I really haven't. I've gotten caught up in different things, that's for sure. But there's always this underlying knowing that ultimately everything is perfect, and it's perfect in a way that none of us can mess it up. And that's really good news. It was as though that experience really helped me look over a fence at the promised land, as it were. It's like gave me a glimpse of heaven. It gave me a glimpse of that thing that I know I'm trying to move towards on a daily basis through living a good life. It really changed my life. I would say that I was very kind of self-centered up until that point, very egotistical at that point. I saw through that journey that we are literally all one thing. And if we are literally all one thing, then if anyone is suffering, then I am suffering. You can't separate the suffering from others from the suffering of yourself if we are all one thing. So it really changed my life. I was kind of grasping at straws at the time on what to do with this knowledge, I started with a website. This was probably 2003 when this happened, so the internet was still fairly new. So the first website I had anything to do with creating was a website called individualwithacause.com. And I just strung up this little website that nobody ever saw. The homepage was, this website is dedicated to sharing that you are perfect, that life is perfect. And here are a few tools I think that might help you realize that. And then the other tabs were the tools, and one of the tools was forgiveness, and forgiveness of anything less than perfection. Another tool was a positive judgment. So rather than judging things negatively, see if there's a way that you could spin it so that you can judge it positively. So just a whole bunch of really naive ways of trying to give back. That really turned me into somebody who I actually went out and started picking up garbage. I was new to East Vancouver at the time, and I noticed compared to where I was living in the West End before that, there just seemed to be a lot more trash on the ground. So I would just go out with a garbage bag and start picking up garbage, and picked up probably hundreds of bags of garbage over the course of a period of time. I would get the most interesting reactions from people. I remember one guy, he looked at me and he's like, "Community service?" I'm like, "Yeah, I guess it is." Not the way he was thinking. But I also learned that when I was in that flow, when I was giving back, when I was just picking up garbage like that, I was hit with more inspired ideas on ways to give back at even higher levels. And really, I feel as though my desire to help Vancouver's downtown east side really got focused through that. My desire to help Vancouver's downtown east side led to the discovery of Iboga as a way to potentially help that neighborhood. It was actually through that shop, The Spirit Within, that I was introduced to Iboga the first time, but I never really put two and two together. And then ultimately led me to working with ibogaine and other psychedelic substances, which has allowed me to help people overcome a lot of suffering. It was as if I had been given an incredible gift, a visceral realization of some of the things I'd been studying and trying to learn about my own spirituality and how to be the best human being on earth. I just started living a life which didn't sweep those insights under the rug. If you go through an experience and you realize we are one with all of creation, we are one with all other human beings on earth, and existence is actually perfect, but nobody is realizing it, so we're dragging ourselves through the mud of suffering needlessly. Well, what do you do about that? What do you do with that information? Do you just, sit in a cave and meditate? That didn't seem like the right path to me. It seemed like a very attractive path, but it seemed more realistic and more what I was called to do, to actually put my feet to the ground and see what I could do to help alleviate suffering on the planet Earth. A lot of people thought I was crazy for some of the moves that I took in my kind of early 20s after that. I was broke myself. What was I doing trying to help people who were suffering? Why don't I just go out and try and make more money for myself? But there seemed to be a real calling that was unveiled through that experience that meant I needed to live a different kind of life, and I needed to give back differently. And I think if you take altruism as far as it can go, it's almost like a Mobius strip that flips back on itself. And altruism is selfish, because I feel and had a hypothesis at a certain time, and now feel that it's true, that nothing feels better than really helping somebody change their life. Nothing feels better than knowing that you're leaving a bit of a trail of blessings behind you in the work that you do. There's nothing that feels better than that. So on a certain level, that's a selfish motive. I want to feel good in that way. I want to feel good knowing that I've truly helped people, that I'm not just a righteous do-gooder telling people how to live a better life, but actually somebody who steps into the fire with people and is able to see the evidence as they move forward in life that those few days they spent with you actually did profoundly change for the better the lives of themselves, their families, and their communities.